So before I begin, obviously I just want to say thank you very much to the Tolkien Society for inviting me to give this paper today. It's very nice of you to have me. So here we go on The Invisible Other, Tolkien's Dwarf-Women and the Feminine Lack. So Tolkien's world of Middle-earth presents the reader with changing landscapes, diverse geographical features, disparate cultures, and many different types of creatures. Some are human, some humanoid, some resemble neither. And in many ways, the reader's journey is both across and through species, as these inform an understanding of the cultural tensions and the conflicts that exist within Middle-earth. Throughout the legendarium, these diverse species articulate their differences through culturally specific mores, such as gender roles, attitudes to procreation, and as well as a consideration of their genesis. Tolkien's portrayal of female characters in The Lord of the Rings is undeniably problematic. Galadriel may be powerful in her own right as one of the last remaining of the ancient Noldor who rebelled against the Valar, and keeper of Nenya, the Ring of Adamant, protecting Lothlorien against encroaching evil. She's also, however, idealized in her beauty and in her effect on the male characters around her. Arwen is revealed only in relation to Aragorn's story, remaining at home mostly to sew banners while the hero battles to save Middle-earth until they can be reunited and married. She's required to sacrifice her one power, her immortality, to be with the one she loves, and is almost an afterthought in terms of her agency within the narrative, appearing only in the appendices. Goldberry is connected to the power of nature, but is depicted primarily through her relationship to male characters. She's Tom Bombadil's wife and the River daughter. Her main role is to be welcoming, provide care and comfort, and produce food for the table. Éowyn begins her story as a shield maiden of Rohan, but ultimately settles for the roles of wife, mother, and healer. Rosie Cotton is invisible until the final chapters, when she's revealed as Sam's fiancée, then wife, then mother to his children. His reward, in other words, after returning from the quest, and a symbol of the resumption of the natural order to society. It would not be true to accuse Tolkien of giving his female characters no agency at all, though. In the Silmarillion, for example, Melian's ability to protect Doriath with her protection spell is strong enough to withstand the attempts of Ungoliant to pass through. Beren can only succeed in his quest for a Silmaril because he has the help of Luthien. Shelob is no pet of Sauron and Ungoliant, her even more fearsome progenitor. She cannot be controlled even by Melkor, once the most powerful of the Ainur. Éowyn may choose to lay down her sword at the end, but this does not make her weak, especially when one considers her strength of will throughout the text to this point. In other words, it would be far too simplistic to simply dismiss Tolkien as a misogynist. As ever, there is greater complexity at play here. Issues regarding the depiction of female characters in Tolkien's work have been well covered in the past by various critics, from Edwin Muir to Catherine Stimson. There's also been some excellent scholarly work done on the question of gender in Tolkien's legendarium, and a great starting point is the essay, The History of Scholarship on Female Characters in J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium, a feminist bibliographic essay by Robin Ann Reed, published in that excellent work, Perilous and Fair, Women in the Life and Works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And in this, Reed offers a detailed list of work in this area of study, starting in the 1970s, where only 2 essays meet her criteria, and on through to the 2000s, in which, as she comments, during the first decade of the 21st century, 23 articles and book chapters were published on Tolkien's female characters, a significant increase. To help explain this, Reed looks to Dimitra Feeney, who in her 2009 monograph, Tolkien, Race and Cultural History, From Fairies to Hobbits, observes that Tolkien's scholarship has started afresh during the last few years, and posits that one potential reason for the rise in academic interest in Tolkien's works is, quote, the boundary between high literature and fiction that appeals to mass audiences has become blurred, especially with the advent of theory and cultural studies. In this context, Tolkien can be rediscovered and reanalyzed in a serious way, a process that has already started in the last few years. But Tolkien's portrayals of female characters were problematic, possibly because his own views on gender were essentialist, as discussed by Anna Small in her Gender in Tolkien's Works entry in the 2007 J.R.R. Tolkien Encyclopedia, edited by Michael Drout. Small refers to Tolkien's 1941 letter to his son Michael, in which he reveals his belief that part of women's quote, subservient helpmeet instinct is, again, quote, to be receptive, stimulated, fertilized in many other matters than the physical by the male. If, as Small comments, this letter reveals that, quote, Tolkien sees the male as naturally active and superior while the female is passive and subordinate by instinct, then we should probably not be surprised to find these beliefs resonating in his writing. This paper does not seek to explore whether Tolkien was anti-women or a misogynist or simply a man entrammelled in the opinions and beliefs of his time. Instead, the purpose of this paper is to examine specific concerns that relate to the issue of gender in Middle-earth, with particular reference to the dwarves. The absence of the maternal figure, the issue of procreation, and the lack of female presence within the narrative. Female dwarves, or dwarf women, do not feature greatly in the legendarium. The only female dwarf who is named is Dis, the daughter of Thrain, and the mother of Fili and Kili, two dwarves from The Hobbit, but she is mentioned only in Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings and not within the narrative itself. It is also discussed in Appendix A that, like the elves and the Númenórean kings, the numbers of dwarf women are low, quote, probably no more than a third of the whole people. The main problem with the scarcity of dwarf women, of course, is that children may also be scarce. Tolkien refers directly to this predicament in the later Quinta Silmarillion in The History of Middle-earth 11, when he writes, "It is said also that their womenkind are few, and that, save their kings and chieftains, few dwarves ever wed. Wherefore their race multiplied slowly and now is dwindling." It is notable, therefore, that Tolkien himself acknowledged the scarcity of dwarf women and the potential consequences of this. The narrative does not indicate that dwarves attached any great importance to the perpetuation of their race. In fact, Tolkien reveals the opposite to be true. Not only do some dwarf women choose not to marry, there appears to be no sense of urgency regarding the situation among male dwarves. Again, in Appendix A, Tolkien tells us that Thorin had no wife, thus illustrating the point that even the most important dwarves rarely marry. In The Lord of the Rings itself, we encounter Gimli, the son of Gloin, who is one of the party of dwarves in The Hobbit. But there's never any reference to Gimli's mother, nor does Tolkien mention any siblings. There's no evidence within the narrative, the appendix, nor even the History of Middle-earth series that Gimli himself either marries or has children, possibly as a result of his great love for Galadriel and his reverence for her beauty, but also possibly due to the dwarves' apparent lack of interest in procreation. Dwarf women themselves are conspicuously absent from the legendarium. According to the Quenta Silmarillion, Aule made only the fathers of the dwarves, and nowhere in the legendarium is there any record of the making of female dwarves. Of Durin the Deathless, the eldest of these fathers of dwarves, Tolkien observes that, quote, his line never failed, so he must have had children, but there's no mention of the dwarf women who must have been their mothers. It is interesting, however, that Tolkien had considered this question, seemingly at some length, whilst he was formulating his ideas on the making of the first dwarves. According to Christopher Tolkien, his father had written a number of roughly drafted passages on this topic. It is in these notes, found in the later Quenta Silmarillion, in the section of the Naugrim and the Edain, that the only mention of the making of female dwarves may be found. Here we can also track Tolkien's development of thought on the issue. Note A, as you can see on the slide, indicates that Aule made no dwarf women, but that Ilúvatar created them as mates for the males that Aule had made. This is the only one of the notes that explains the existence of the dwarf women in this way. All of the others show Aule himself as creator of the females, although Tolkien offers a number of possible explanations for both their creation and their number. Both Note B and Note C show Aule creating only 6 females to the 7 males, with the reason given that he wearied before he could make a 7th. It is interesting also to see that we are told in Note C that Durin was laid alone. Well, how then would his line continue? This is especially noteworthy, as it is Durin who is singled out for the comment that his line never failed, and not the other dwarves, for whom Aule seemingly did create these unnamed female mates. In contrast, Note D has Aule creating an equal number of both, apparently in obedience to the desire of Ilúvatar. By Note E, however, Tolkien had reverted to his original idea of only 6 dwarf women to the 7 dwarf fathers, with the eldest, Durin, being buried alone. Why Tolkien decides this is not apparent from the text, but his decision again begs the question of the continuation of Durin's line. This was not the end of Tolkien's musings on the issue, though. He continued this discussion in his letter 211 to Rona Beer in 1958, in which he reiterates the idea of there being 7 dwarfs and 6 dwarf women, or mates, writing that Aule, quote, had made 13, and in a note at the bottom of the page confirming, quote, 1, the eldest alone, and 6 more with 6 mates. There's some important points to be made here. First, Tolkien's thoughts on the subject tended to an inequality in the numbers of dwarf women from the very beginning, thus presaging the difficulties the dwarves would face in enabling the continuation of their species. Second, the dwarf women are specifically created as mates for the dwarf fathers, with all the implications that come with such a term. Finally, and most significantly, despite all these draft passages and continued discussion in his letters, Tolkien discarded every one of these explanations for the existence of dwarf women and chose instead to excise them from the moment of creation. In his commentary on the later Silmarillion, Christopher Tolkien notes, quote, in the final text, as printed in the Silmarillion, my father evidently abandoned the question of the origin of the female dwarves, finding it intractable and the solutions unsatisfactory. Moreover, in the finished form, the element of the eldest, Durin, being distinct from the others and without mate, finds no place. Perhaps this issue, like the matter of the origin of the orcs, proved troublesome enough for Tolkien that he never fully resolved it for himself. However, as a result, even in their moment of origin, dwarf women are obscured. So from the very beginning of the histories of the dwarves, it is clear that there is not only a lack of emphasis on reproduction, but also that dwarf women are seemingly invisible, their existence almost completely ignored. They appear to be of so little significance within dwarf culture that they're removed from these dwarf histories. In a note in The Making of Appendix A on the absence of record concerning female dwarves, Tolkien himself tells us that, quote, they are seldom named in genealogies. They join their husbands' families. But if a son is seen to be 110 or so years younger than his father, this usually indicates an elder daughter. Thorin's sister Dis is named simply because of the gallant death of her sons Fili and Kili in defense of Thorin II. A gap indicates an elder daughter. Talk about invisibility. Thus, apart from the few comments to be found within the appendix to The Lord of the Rings and in the later Quenta Silmarillion, Tolkien omits dwarf women with no further explanation of this invisibility, and none are encountered in any of the narratives. So dwarf women then are present only in relation to the male dwarves, a point that is emphasized by the way in which they are shaded from the eyes of the world. Tolkien describes in the later Quenta Silmarillion that female dwarves are indiscernible from the males, except in the fact that they rarely leave their homes to go out into the world, as, quote, they go not to war and seldom save at direst need issue from their deep bowers and halls. In her work, Desire in Language, Julia Kristeva positions the figure of woman as, quote, the silence or incoherence of the pre-discursive. She is the other, which stands outside and threatens to disrupt the conscious, rational order of speech, which speaks clearly to the situation of Tolkien's dwarf women. Although they are never, we are told, forced into marriage, nevertheless, they live a life of seclusion, rarely entering the world, and they're never unaccompanied. We may also note that their very femininity is disguised, even removed, as seen in the suggestion in Appendix A, that they are so similar in appearance to the male dwarves that, quote, the eyes and ears of other people cannot tell them apart. According to these notes in the later Quenta Silmarillion, dwarf women are also given the masculine indicator of beards and cannot, quote, be discerned by those of other race, be it in feature or in gait or in voice. Not even permitted their own physical form, female dwarves are the invisible women of Tolkien's legendarium. Denied acknowledgement or recognition, they are situated on a border that separates self and not self. But again, this does not mean that they are entirely without agency. Tolkien tells us that not only can dwarf women choose not to marry, but many also choose to be childless, thus implying that neither sex puts greater emphasis on reproduction. As dwarf women have this choice with marriage and childbearing not forced upon them, it becomes plain that they're not merely valued for the stereotypical gender role. But why then are they so hidden from view? Well, here it might be useful to look to de Beauvoir's thoughts on complicity. In The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir offers many examples of the ways in which women can be complicit in reinforcing what she refers to as their own unfreedom, due to socialization, internalized misogyny, and, importantly, the ways in which situation and coercive social setting can dictate complicity either through necessity or through learned compliance. Long-standing habit, she explains, can keep women's rights from being correctly manifested, as society is inherently unequal and keeps women in an existential otherness in which she is a passive object to a man's active subject. As such, quote, she determines and differentiates herself in relation to man, and he does not in relation to her. She is the inessential in front of the essential. He is the subject. He is the absolute. She is the other. If we apply this thinking to Tolkien's Dwarf-Women, we can see that there is a question to be asked then about their position within their own culture, especially in terms of identity. With the similarity in appearance to male dwarves and the lack of emphasis on the traditionally female role of mother, how do dwarf women identify themselves? Kimberly Carter-Cram, in a discussion of de Beauvoir's ideas on positions of self, defines identity as pertaining to, quote, one's individuality, indeed to the lack of sameness of one's character, as these traits express themselves in a variety of different times and situations. However, the only identity that the dwarf women have that is accessible by the reader is constructed for them only through Tolkien's notes in Appendix A and the History of Middle-earth series. It is significant that these notes, like the dwarf women, stand outside the narrative. In The Second Sex, de Beauvoir discusses such loss of identity and refers to it as the feminine lack, the negative space against which the masculine identity differentiates itself. In appearance, male and female dwarves are so similar that this is not offered as a way to distinguish between them. Instead, the reader may recognize the figure of the male dwarf by, for example, the fact that he goes out into the world. In other words, one gender may be determined by what the other is not. Jenny Robinson follows Judith Butler's theories on this particular point when she makes the argument that gender identities are, quote, produced in the performative reiteration of culturally specific understandings of masculinity and femininity. In her essay, Sex and Gender in Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, Judith Butler understands de Beauvoir's famous assertion that, quote, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, as enabling a differentiation between the terms sex and gender. Butler reads this as suggesting that gender is an aspect of identity that is gradually acquired, pointing towards a more radical understanding of gender. If this is the case, one must still question how the dwarf women are able to identify as female, as so little seems to be offered them to enable the formulation of such an understanding of gender. The only identity offered to Tolkien's dwarf women, therefore, is constructed through simple biology. They are female, they may bear children. We know they do that because some children are mentioned in the text. This forces them to be read as having one common identity, a problem that Butler highlights in her essay, Gender Trouble. If one is a woman, she declares, quote, that surely is not all one is. The term fails to be exhaustive, not because a pre-gendered person transcends the specific paraphernalia of its gender, but because gender is not always constituted coherently or consistently in different historical contexts, and because gender intersects with racial, class, ethnic, sexual, and regional modalities of discursively constituted identities. Reducing the identity of dwarf women to gender denies them any other characteristics that may offer individuality, rather than a collective signifier. Within Tolkien's legendarium, there are no female dwarf characters that might enable the reader to formulate an impression of personality, disposition, behavior, or features. If, as Anouk Nayak and Mary Jane Kahili contend, quote, identity is a type of doing that is only made manifest at the point of action, then this is something to which dwarf women can have little claim. It is not merely biology that restricts them, their location within dwarf culture and the resulting interpretations of dwarf gender norms is the most limiting factor. As Butler asserts, quote, the limits to gender, the range of possibilities for a lived interpretation of a sexually differentiated anatomy, seem less restricted by anatomy itself than by the weight of the cultural institutions which have conventionally interpreted anatomy. the figure of the dwarf woman, silenced through lack of representation in the narrative and hidden by means of author-enforced physical disguise, therefore suffers almost total loss of identity in the Middle-earth legendarium. With no sense of self except in relation to male dwarves, she cannot say, I am here, only he is here, I'm elsewhere. She's not merely marginalised, she's also effectively excluded from the narrative. The dwarf woman is the most contained of all the females of Middle-earth, made other by her own race. If gender differences are socially or culturally constructed, and that culture places constraints on one gender's ability to create individual identities, then this may go some way to explain the invisibility of the dwarf women of Middle-earth. Thank you for listening.
That was spectacular. Thank you so much, Sara. An original take on a part of Tolkien's universe that I think not everyone necessarily thinks of as well. So thank you very much for digging into this area for us. Right, time for some questions. Okay, so let's dig straight in. Okay, so the first question then asks, do you think that this problematic portrayal of women is due to the fact that Tolkien was a British male writing about medieval fantasy in the early 20th century? So is it perhaps the contextual point that is making this problematic?
Well, I think as I referred to partway through the talk, we can understand some of Tolkien's ideas on female-male gender roles through his own letters, definitely the ones to his son Michael, in which he discusses his opinions of the feminine, if you like. But what I don't want to do here with this talk is actually put words in Tolkien's mouth, because I think that doesn't actually get us anywhere. If we look at the way in which female characters are portrayed, it isn't simple. We've got such a diverse range of female figures in the text, some of whom are portrayed as you know, kind of Valkyrie-esque figures with great power and agency, and some of whom less so. So, you know, everything from Melian through to Rosie Cotton. Each has their place, each speaks to something that Tolkien understood in his own experience of women and his own reading experience of female characters. But again, I don't want to put words in his mouth. This is what I see in the text, in the way in which he's portraying or choosing not to portray certain figures. I hope that kind of addresses the question.
I'd say, yeah, it's definitely a point where we have a tendency to jump to context.
Right, yeah. Context has a place. It absolutely has a place. But if we stop and say, I know what Tolkien was thinking here, I think we're making a fundamental error. In talking about the dwarf women, like I said, I am not claiming Tolkien is a misogynist. I'm saying, here is what I see with these female characters and their lack of appearance within the text. I think it's really important to have some grasp of context, absolutely, but never to say, I know what Tolkien meant here. I know what he was thinking. And mine is that the only interpretation because I know what Tolkien was considering at this point. It's just one of those fundamental errors, I think, which is one of the things that's great about this particular seminar, is that here we have a real understanding of the fact that these are optics through which we are all viewing the same text, but we all get to see that text in the way that we wish to view it. And different readings from different people with different lived experiences and different backgrounds, this is what we get, which I think is great.
Yeah, exactly. Very well answered. Thank you. Okay, so second question. What do you think is the context about the sons of Fëanor being so reticent to accepting new language in relation to their traumatic experiences?
I'm not sure that question's for me.
No, okay, sorry.
a great question. Don't think it's for me.
Oh, there are indeed. Right, I'm not in the right area of the chat. Let me sort this out.
I was suddenly thinking, Fëanor, damn, didn't read up on them before doing this.
My brain was like, why am I saying this? Here we go. Right. Do you think an argument could be made for the dwarves actually being a gender, that is genderless, if they are indistinguishable from the male dwarves? The passages about them rarely venturing outside would prove that idea wrong, but then dwarves by themselves also rarely leave their mountain homes without reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. That's a really interesting question. I think we can point to Tolkien's discussion of someone like Dis as the mother of. But of course, as we know, if we are stepping outside of gendered bodies, we can't say that it's only one gender that can give birth. Here we have, and I don't want to get all completely mixed up here because I'm trying to make sure I get the language correct. We know that various bodies are capable of giving birth. Okay, so we do have that. If we want to make the argument that dwarves are a gender, I think we've got one of the best cases to make here, that we have a race in which there's such a lack of differentiation between the two, that the blurring of that boundary is almost complete, almost. All we have is those few notes in the later Quenta Silmarillion, in the Appendices, and that is it. So I can really see how somebody could make that argument, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, here we have a figure, as you can see on the slide. For those who can't see on the slide, I have pictures of depictions of dwarf women, and they are clearly feminine faces, but with the masculine indicator of beards. Here we have that real blurring of a boundary between genders, in that a beard is a masculine indicator. So yeah, I mean, I would love to actually read someone's paper where they made that argument, because I think it would be fascinating.